how it works, the RaceBird, the format, and the physics of flight. Every new sport has a machine at its center. Not just a tool, not just a vehicle, a machine that carries the logic of the whole idea. In Formula 1, it is the car. In cycling, the bike. In sailing, the boat and the wind together. And in E1, it is something stranger. A race boat that wants to stop behaving like a normal boat. Because the central promise of E1 is not simply that it is electric. That alone would not be enough. The central promise is that this machine can make a new kind of marine racing feel plausible, dramatic, and visually unforgettable. E1's RaceBird is presented by the series as an all-electric foiling race boat designed to combine advanced electric propulsion with hydrofoil technology and to create a form of racing that is both high performance and lower impact than conventional powerboat categories. And that means that episode 2 is where the vision meets engineering, because in episode 1 we looked at the dream. Now we have to ask the harder question: how does the dream actually work? On first encounter, the RaceBird looks slightly wrong. Not wrong in the sense of failure, wrong in the sense of unfamiliarity. It does not fit easily into old categories. It is not a conventional speedboat with an electric motor inserted into it. It does not look like a yacht, a jet ski, or a classic racing hull. It looks like the product of someone asking what a raceboat might become if it were designed from the beginning around electrification, efficiency, spectacle, and control. That distinction matters, because if you build for electricity from the start, rather than adopting an older machine, you can rethink the whole system. Weight distribution, hydrodynamics, acceleration profile, stability, drag, race format, even the soundscape of the sport itself. The RaceBird is described by E1 and its technology partners as the centerpiece of the championship, developed as a high-performance, all-electric foiling race boat rather than a retrofit of a traditional marine design. And that changes not only the hardware, it changes the philosophy. To understand why, we have to begin with the oldest problem in boating. Water is slow. Or more precisely, water is resistant. It is dense, relentlessly so. Every boat moving through it is fighting drag. Every increase in speed asks for disproportionate effort. To go faster, you need more power, and more power usually means more weight, more structural demand, more instability, more cost, and more violence in the interaction between hull and surface. This is one reason why marine performance is difficult to scale elegantly. On land, tires roll over a prepared surface. In the air, once lift is established, movement changes character entirely. On water, you are trapped in a difficult in-between state. You float, but you also plow. You move, but you drag a great deal of resistance with you. So the question becomes, how do you make a boat faster without turning it into an increasingly brutal contest against the medium? The answer, at least in E1, is you stop trying to remain fully in the water. That is what the hydrofoils are for. A hydrofoil works, in simple terms, like an underwater wing. As the boat gains speed, water flows over and under the foil surfaces in a way that creates lift. Once enough lift is generated, much of the hull rises above the water. And once that happens, the entire physics of movement changes. Drag drops dramatically because the hull is no longer pushing through the surface in the same way. The boat becomes more efficient, more agile in some respects, and visually much more extraordinary. E1 explicitly describes the RaceBird as using foiling technology to rise above the water while being driven by electric propulsion. That is the technical function, but it also has a narrative function. Because a foiling raceboat does not merely move, it appears to transcend the very medium it is racing on. And that matters enormously in a new sport. A normal boat is easy to categorize, a flying boat is not. The RaceBird immediately creates a visual difference that spectators can understand even before they understand the details. You do not need to know the battery architecture or foil geometry to realize that something unusual is happening. The image itself does part of the explanatory work. That is good engineering, but it is also good theater. And E1 needs both, because electric racing on water faces a double challenge. First, it has to function. Second, it has to persuade. People must believe the machine is technically credible, but they must also feel that it is exciting enough to justify a championship. That is where electric propulsion becomes more interesting than many critics assume. There is a common mistake in how people think about electric performance. They hear electric and imagine restraint, limitation, compromise. Something cleaner, perhaps, but less visceral. In reality, electric systems can produce an entirely different emotional texture. Instant torque, immediate acceleration, a clean, sharp response profile, less mechanical delay, a different relationship between power and control. In one early official RaceBird test description, E1 said the boat used a 150 kilowatt Chrysler battery and a Mercury Racing outboard motor, with the craft lifting quickly onto its foils thanks to instant torque and acceleration. Even without dwelling on the exact numbers, the principle matters. Electric propulsion is not just a quieter substitute. In this format, it is part of what makes the machine behave the way it does. And because the sound is different, the whole sensory grammar of the sport changes too. Traditional powerboat racing tends to announce itself through aggression. Noise comes first, force comes first. The machine dominates the scene. E1 does something more subtle. The electric sound is smoother, narrower, almost futuristic in its restraint. Which means the visual drama has to work harder. The lifting, the carving, the tight turns, the spray, the proximity of the circuit, the precision of the drivers, all of that becomes more important. In other words, the sport shifts emphasis from brute sensory overload to engineered elegance. That is not weakness. That may in fact become one of its greatest strengths. Then there is the question of why E1 uses a standardized boat platform. And this is one of the most intelligent structural decisions in the championship. When a new sport is born, too much technical freedom can kill clarity. If every team builds radically different boats from the start, the story quickly fragments. Fans no longer know whether they are watching pilot skill, team strategy, engineering budget, or some combination too opaque to follow. Costs rise, competitive gaps harden, the machinery can overshadow the category before the category even has an identity. A spec series solves much of that. By centering competition around the same RaceBird platform, E1 gives itself room to establish the championship first. The race weekends, the teams, the pilots, the circuit style, the visual language, the public mythology. The official E1 positioning emphasizes the RaceBird as the common machine around which the championship is built, rather than a category defined by totally open equipment development. This means the competition feels cleaner, not easier. cleaner. The pilots matter more visibly. The starts matter more. The racing lines matter more. The handling matters more. And that is exactly what a young championship needs. It needs to teach people what counts. Which brings us to the pilots. One of the defining features of E1 is that its teams are built around mixed-gender driver lineups. The championship describes itself as featuring up to 10 teams and 20 mixed-gender pilots racing on tight, technical water circuits in iconic cities. This is not a decorative point. It changes the sporting identity of the whole series. Because many established categories treat inclusion as an external conversation, something adjacent to the sport. E1 bakes it into the architecture from the start. That sends a signal. This is not a championship trying to modernize its image after decades of inheritance. It is a championship born inside contemporary expectations. And structurally, that matters. A new sport has an unusual freedom. It can choose which norms to inherit and which to discard. It does not have to pretend that old conversations are natural. It can design its identity with intention. E1 seems to understand that very well. The result is that the pilots are not just operators of a machine. They are part of the championship's broader argument about what modern sport can look like when it is designed from a blank page. Then there is the race format itself. E1's official descriptions repeatedly emphasize tight and technical circuits in iconic urban and coastal locations. That is important, because format is what turns a machine into a spectacle. It is not enough to have a clever boat. You need a competitive environment that makes the boat's strength legible. And tight and technical is exactly the right phrase. It tells you that this is not simply about top speed. It is about handling, about judgment, about how quickly a pilot can trust the lift, place the boat, recover from instability, and manage the narrow margin between clean control and expensive error. A wide open straight tells one kind of story. A compact circuit tells another. It forces the viewer to watch transitions, entry speed, exit discipline, decision-making under pressure. It makes a sport look less like a raw power contest and more like a test of intelligent precision. That is a clever match for electric foiling technology, because the machine itself already suggests sophistication. The format then reinforces that impression. This is not a championship of noise and chaos. It is a championship of technical control under unusual conditions. And unlike land racing, the water never becomes fully domesticated, which means every turn contains an argument with the medium itself. If you listen closely, you can hear the difference. Not only in the powertrain, but in the rhythm of the machine. A conventional powerboat often sounds like domination. The RaceBird sounds like negotiation. That may be the most interesting thing about it. Because foiling is not a simple victory over water. It is a conditional arrangement with it. The boat rises only if speed, balance, and geometry cooperate. The machine does not bully the medium. It depends on understanding it. Too little control and the promise collapses. Too much instability and the visual elegance disappears. Too much compromise and the whole championship starts to look theoretical rather than thrilling. So, every successful run of a RaceBird is really a kind of proof. Proof that power can be cleaner without becoming dull. Proof that marine performance can become more sophisticated rather than merely more forceful. Proof that engineering, if designed well enough, can convert efficiency into beauty. That is why the machine matters so much. Not because fans will memorize all its components, but because it embodies the thesis of the sport. The RaceBird is also a fascinating example of how sport functions as prototype culture. Many people will never drive an electric foil in craft. Many will never sit in a marine battery test lab. Most will never spend time thinking seriously about the future of waterborne mobility. But they might watch a race. And once they do, a previously abstract category becomes imaginable. That is one of the strange superpowers of competition. It makes frontier technologies feel culturally real before they become commercially normal. E1 itself frames the RaceBird and the championship as part of a broader effort to influence future commercial electric boating and to accelerate sustainable marine mobility. In that sense, E1 is doing what motorsport has often done at its best. It dramatizes innovation. It creates a public arena in which engineering is not hidden inside a white paper or a procurement strategy, but staged in motion. People do not merely hear that something is possible. They see it work under pressure. And when they see it work, the category becomes harder to dismiss. That is why episode 2 matters. Because once you understand how the machine works, E1 stops looking like a branding exercise built around a fashionable vocabulary. It begins to look like a serious attempt to design a new sporting object, one that integrates propulsion, aerodynamics, hydrodynamics, race format, and public image into a coherent whole. Not every new sport achieves that. This one, at least conceptually, comes surprisingly close. Still, mechanics alone do not explain why a championship survives. A machine can be elegant and still remain culturally marginal. A race format can be clever and still fail to matter. Technology can work beautifully and still not justify the emotional investment of teams, fans, sponsors, and cities. Which means the deeper question is still ahead of us. Not how the boat works, but how the whole thing is meant to stand for. Because E1 is never presented as pure racing. Its official identity is tied to larger claims about coastal futures, clean technology, restoration, and what it calls blue impact. The sport is designed not only to perform, but to signify. And that is where the next step in the story begins. Because once the machine is real, the question becomes ideological. What is this championship trying to mean? Is it simply a clever electric motorsport? A marine innovation platform? A sustainability narrative with races attached? Or a genuine attempt to shift how people think about water, technology, and responsibility? Next time, we will leave the engineering table and move into the larger argument. We look at what E1 says it stands for. Sustainability, regeneration, blue impact, coastal protection, and the effort to make a sporting spectacle carry a wider public purpose. Because building a fast machine is one thing. Convincing the world that it means something is another.